It's a pleasure for me to introduce Professor Greg Mobley. Greg teaches Hebrew Scriptures, or Old Testament as Christians call it, at Yale Divinity School. I've known Greg since he was 23 years old and I was 23. We were both raised in the South, he in Campbellsville, Kentucky, and the religious landscape of our childhood was a vast cultural sea of fundamentalism and evangelicalism. And we both ended up becoming little islands of liberal thought in this enormous ocean.
They had great music.
They did. And that meant you had to learn to read the Bible subversively to survive, and that subversive reading has informed Greg's creativity ever since. In the Baptist tradition, you started pastoring churches before you ever finished your education, and we were both pastors of the smallest churches in Breckinridge County, Kentucky. And our Dr. Vater, Glenn Henson, who preached at both of our churches and was eventually educated at Cambridge, used to carry around a Greek New Testament wherever he preached and just read and translate from it freely. I brought mine today because I can kind of feel his spirit together, being with Greg one more time. When we were in seminary, smart guys learned to read Hebrew and Greek, and everybody took a little bit of Latin, but the really smart guys could read around in Ugaritic and Akkadian, the languages of the ancient Near East where writing was literally invented, and Greg was one of those guys. With fundamentalism all across the Bible Belt, just when we graduated from seminary, we didn't know what to do, so we both applied to PhD programs up east, as they say. And I remember our country pastors, just after we graduated, or just before we were graduating from seminary, teasing Greg, asking if he was going to go from a church of 20 to a church of 40 now that he had a master's of divinity degree. And Greg had back then much more of that southern twang that we both had. And he had that kind of halting sense of manners. And I remember him saying, "Oh, actually, I have a scholarship to study at Harvard." And I was like, yes, you know. Greg ended up being one of John Levinson's students at Harvard, arguably the most creative biblical scholar of his generation. He wrote his dissertation on the hero period in the Old Testament, which is where you get characters like David and Goliath and Samson and Delilah. He taught at Union Seminary for a year and then went to Andover Newton Theological Seminary. He's been at Yale the past year. And he stands in a long line of subversive Christians who went on to become great liberals in the South, from Will Campbell to Wendell Berry, to Flannery O'Connor, to Eudora Welty, to Walker Percy, to Bill Moyers, and to Jimmy Carter. And all of these had a deep countercultural trend in the South, and I always thought that the best liberals were produced in the South because they knew what it meant to live around real oppression and yearn for the bright light of freedom. Today he's preaching on Ruth, and I passed out translations that he actually did, and they're on these little yellow sheets of paper if you'd like to see what that's really all about. I try to translate a few passages every year, but this is the way you actually do it. And I invite you to an interesting second hour that we're going to have, which will have ample question and answer time. If you ever wondered what Julie and Caroline and Mark and I actually studied in school, you can get a really good insight of the most interesting parts of it in 1 hour. And Greg and his wife, Paige, had 3 children. The oldest one graduated from Smith. His oldest son graduated from Yale, where he led the basketball team to win the Ivy League title the last couple of years. And his third son is studying at Amherst and is also playing basketball there. It's been a treasure to cross paths with him periodically over the years, and a blessing to have him here today. He's like a mature Kentucky bourbon. It goes down easy. But be careful how much of it you have, because you'll start thinking crazy thoughts after a while. So, his latest book is The Return of the Chaos Monsters. It gives me great pleasure to welcome him here today. Thank you.
Well, let's read some Bible, all right? So do you see the insert? I mean, I was really hoping, that we would just read this text and we'd all get it. It was during the days when warlords made justice. that there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah went to seek whatever work he could find in the fields of Moab. It was he, his wife, and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. You can see what that means. The name of the woman was Naomi, which means sweetie. You know Naima? That name? John Coltrane? Naima, Naomi. That's the Arabic, the Hebrew. Same word, sweetie. Have we got one here? Is that what? Honey, sweetie, all those. But it's a taste. And the names of the 2 sons. Now, this is like where the biblical writer is a little bit like Charles Dickens. Were Machlon and Kilion, which means skinny and scrawny. So you know they're not going to make it past the first act. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They arrived in the fields of Moab, and that is how they came to be there. And now we got to have a problem, because you can't have a story without a problem. So here we go. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite wives. The name of the first was Orpah, which in Hebrew means perfume. So I thought, well, let's translate it Chanel. And the name of the second was Ruth, which means friendship. And I have here amity, but then I realized that's too complicated. Let's just call her Amy. Let's call her Amy. Don't you think Ruth's an Amy? Then they settled in there for 10 years. And then both of them, Machlon and Kilion, died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the fields of Moab, because while in the fields of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. So she set out from her place there, her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and started walking down the road to return to the land of Judah. And now you know this part, don't you? I hope you can anticipate it. You've seen this scene before and you love it. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to the house of her mother." And that's unusual. Usually in the Bible, it's always the father's house, in my father's house. This is only one of a handful of times it talks about the house of the mother. "Return, my daughters, and may the Lord show the same kindness, chesed, the same kindness to you that you have toward the dead and those still standing above ground. And may the Lord allow you to find haven, each in the house of her husband." And she kissed them. Well, then they raised their voices. It's time for them to say something. But they wept and said to her, "Never. We will return with you to your people." Are you still with me? This is a long Bible passage. All right. I mean, it's good, right? And Naomi said, "Why should you go with me? Are there still any sons in my belly that could become husbands for you? Return, my daughters, go, for I am too old even to be with a man, and even if I thought I still had hopes, prospects. Even if I were with a man this night and then bore sons, would you wait till they grew up?" Isn't that funny? How her logic. "Would you bar yourself from being with a man? No, my daughters, for that would be more bitter for me." You see, now the Naomi name thing is coming out. she's sweetie, and she says, that would make my life even more bitter, because later in the chapter, she's going to say, don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara. Call me bitter. For the hand of the Lord has struck me. And they raised their voices and wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth, okay, you get that? She clung to her. And she said, look, your sister-in-law has returned unto her mother and unto her God. Return after your sister-in-law. Then Ruth said, do not keep pestering me to abandon you, to turn back from following you, for wherever you will go, I will go. And where you spend the night, I will spend the night. Your people, my people. And your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there let me be buried. And may the Lord do so to me, and add even more, if anything short of death separates me from you. And when she, Naomi, saw that she, Ruth, was undefeatable from going with her, she quit making speeches to her. Isn't it amazing? Oh, there's so much I want to say. Chuck, that was so nice, all the things you said, but I could do a whole sermon on Kate and Chuck. Do you understand that? And now I could do one on Mark, because I know Mark, and I witness the way he is channeling these chords, mystic chords. And thank you. You take me there regularly. And then I just feel so welcome here. And last night I got to have dinner with some of you anyway. Dang it, this is nice. But we got to get through this text. I mean, I'm looking at the kids and I'm thinking, wow, now I got a whole other sermon I actually want to preach to you, but I won't. It has to do with the fact that a couple weeks ago I was in a church in New Haven called Community Tabernacle Baptist Church. Have you met Keith King? Anyways, a pastor there. And they had their little church mice, like the 6 and 7-year-old choir. They sang freedom, freedom, freedom all over me. And they sang, 6-year-olds sang, before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in the grave. And I thought, wow, these people are programming their children. And they're not the least bit, in a way, perturbed by old so-and-so. Because they're already training for this. And they already understand, and they're trying to program these children to believe that you are justified. That is the reason you have standing, the reason you count, the reason you can hold your head up high. It's because of something invisible. We call that faith. The reason you count is because you believe, but you can't see it, that God made you in God's image and loves you. And you're not justified by the fact that you've got networks and degrees and standing in an external world. Doesn't matter. They've already taught their children that. That's what they're teaching them. I hope we teach our kids that. So when they don't get the right response, it doesn't affect who they deeply are, because their identity isn't focused on all this external poultry manure. All right? But I'm sorry, we got to get to Ruth. So, it was during the days when the warlords made justice that there was a famine in the land. The opening lines of Ruth take us to the time of judges. In the King James Version, it says, in the days when the judges judged. You may not know the book of Judges, but I'm going to remind you. I mean, the book of Judges, it says finally that every man did what was right in his own eyes. It was a time when the warlords were in charge. Those warlords included Abimelech, who tried to cover up the assassination of all his political rivals by ritual sanction. Those warlords included Samson, who could not keep his hands off pink knitted hats. There was Jephthah, a deeply insecure man whose big mouth led him into trouble, most notably when he made a hasty vow to secure a victory, and then he felt compelled with fatal consequences to enact his vow. The story of Jephthah. The days of the judges. The final story in the book of Judges is about the kidnapping of young women to become sex slaves. Only the villains aren't ISIS, and they're not Boko Haram. They're the elders of Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. So as the book of Ruth begins, there's an utter leadership vacuum. And in truth, good leaders were always hard to find in the Bible, in Bible days. You know, if you read the book of Kings, you realize they got a good king about once a century. That's about it. A Hezekiah, a Jehoshaphat, a Josiah. The others were all crooks. But when they had a good king, the king's power would be held in check by a constitution they called Torah, one that was given to them by a founding father, Moses. And then that constitution, Torah, was safeguarded and interpreted by a generation of people they called prophets, who stood along the watchtower as sentries to guard their society. And according to those prophets, and I've noticed they're in your windows. Do you know that? Jeremiah's way back there. Isaiah's somewhere. According to those prophets, Israel's greatest enemies were never the Assyrians and the Babylonians. That is the ancient expression of cultures we know as Syrians and Iraqis. The greatest enemies were never Assyrians and Babylonians. The greatest enemies were the leaders, penchant for injustice, and the people's penchant for whatever form of idolatry was then in vogue. That was the greatest danger. And then our story begins in the time of the judges, mainly set in a village called Bethlehem. And can't you already tell how in this little town the hopes and fears of all the years are going to be met? You know, you start out thinking you're reading the Bible, and all of a sudden it reads you. There was a famine, and poor people on either side of a certain river, the Jordan, but it might as well be called the Rio Grande. It was the political border between Israel and Moab. There's a famine, and so that border is meaningless. A political border, the only border that counted to these people was the border between the land of famine and the land of harvest. So a family leaves Judah to live as refugees. Their word is sojourn. In Moab, Elimelech and Naomi, sweetie and then skinny and scrawny. The Hebrew word, I said this, used to describe their journey is to sojourn. And in these Tex-Mex borderlands around, like the Jordan, sojourning was common. Away from centers of culture and power like Jerusalem, landless farmers would just go back and forth across that border because they had to have work, they had to have food. The book of Ruth doesn't mention, but it's true, how dangerous that crossing was. If you read the book of Judges, you'd know that thousands died crossing that Jordan. Most of the time because they didn't say the right words when they crossed. They didn't say the shibboleth. So crossing that Jordan. And that's how the game is played when you live under the rule of warlords. If you don't say the right words, you could get executed. Well, we haven't even gotten past the first verse. I need you to already know the rest of the story, okay? About how the sons got married to Perfume and Amy. And then how Skinny and Scrawny left the scene. Naomi decides to come back to Bethlehem. Orpah decides to stay home. And then we finally get to the crossroads where two widows have an argument. Naomi embodies her entire society. At the end of chapter 1, we didn't read this. Naomi will say, I used to be sweet, now my name's bitter. And she will also say, I used to be full. Life was full. I had family. I had kids. I had husband. I had networks. I had a full life. She says, now I feel empty. It's like the famine's inside her. So at a crossroads, in a time of famine, a time of bitter, a time of empty, what gives? When everyone is empty, when everyone is bitter, when there is a famine of bread and kindness and hospitality, what gives? Well, in this story, a woman who has nothing gives. Ruth, by all appearances, has nothing. She has no husband. She doesn't have the protection of her birth family anymore, her dad, her brothers. She's going to a foreign land. She has no papers, no status, no economic resources. She's got no dowry, no prospects, no networks. Ruth is off the social grid. But Ruth rummaged around and reached deep into her soul's purse and found she did have something. She had a widow's mite of something. She had the power of her sacred soul created in the image of God. She had the dignity of her free soul to make a promise and try by the grace of God to keep it. By worldly standards, Ruth had nothing, but Ruth had something the world can't give and the world can't take away. Ruth had the gold of her soul's treasure. Ruth, it turns out, had faithfulness. The Hebrew word is chesed. And it means an undefeatable commitment to do the right thing for love's sake. That's what she had. And she gave it, and it jump-started the whole economy. All of a sudden, things began to flip. That's the crazy thing. Because again, we don't have time for the rest of the story. But this woman who has nothing gives. And all of a sudden, Naomi comes back to life. And soon she's doing her thing again. She's got her mojo back. She's matchmaking. She's scheming to get people together. And then there's this old maid of a man named Boaz who shows up. And all of a sudden, he's doing his little tricky, legal deals to make things come out right for people. And then under the cover of a sleeping bag. Ruth and Boaz get something else going. And, there's a toy surprise in this box of Cracker Jack personalities. Because at the end of the book of Ruth, it says that Ruth's great-grandson is David. And it just makes you wonder right now, who's out there getting born? Huh? A Ruth? A David? The story of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz is tinkers to Evers to chance. It's like some O. Henry story where people give what they have and it completes each other. It's a story about empty people who fill the spaces in each other. It's about how God can take discards and make them face cards. Ordinary people who don't count for anything yield the King of Hearts, David. Oh, but it took a single small act of courage and outrage and generosity to reset the system. You see, that's the key. Ruth writes a check she's not sure she'll be able to cover, and it jumpstarts the economy. What's that, Keynesian? I forget. Anyway. Famine to harvest, aloneness to family, empty to full, bitter to sweet. But it starts with a single small gift. Do you remember that song from youth group? It only takes a spark. Well, anybody got a light? I love this story so much. It's a red state story. It doesn't take place in Jerusalem, Manhattan. It takes place in Bowling Green, Bethlehem. It's a story about golden people, people with unrealized royalty inside them. Everyday people, country people, courageous people. It's a story that says to us, daggone it, don't pay so much attention to the headlines, but look up, because beyond them there's a tree, and in it is this nest of sparrows, like Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, and then beyond them, the Son of Righteousness is rising with healing in his wings. Don't doubt that. I've gone on enough, but there's one more thing I want to say. Because the title of the sermon is Undefeatable. Well, where'd that come from? There's one more word we haven't talked about in this story from the Bible in Hebrew. Because, Naomi gives her speeches, and there's 3 of them. It is a story. It's got to take 3 times to work. And finally, it says, when she saw that Ruth just wouldn't budge, that she was undefeatable from going with her, she quit trying to talk her out of it. Well, that word, undefeatable in Hebrew, all right, it's mitametzit. It's very unusual to use it of a woman because mitametzit describes the behavior of a soldier in one of those Braveheart-like scrums they used to have, where here comes our side with their little swords, and here comes that side with their little swords, and then there is a moment of truth. Because the battle's going to be won or lost when one person on one side goes, oh no, I'm out of here. And as soon as that person flees, his mate goes, Mike, I got to get out of here. And soon it's something the Bible describes as panic. And one side is running often back into their second line approaching. And the battle is won or lost because there are people on one side who refuse to turn around. And that's the word, mitametzit. And that's the word used of Ruth, that she would stand her ground, come what may, never back down, semper ethan fi. This beatitude of a story where the meek inherit, the hungry and thirsty are filled, the peacemakers see their dreams come true. It is hard not to hear political undertones, overtones, right down the middle tones in this text. And I heard them, and I wanted, I tried to get out of the way so you could hear them. But finally, this isn't about politics. And finally, I'm a Baptist preacher. I'm not a political blogger. You can read those people in the Times, you want that. And, there's some of you who may be here this morning, and I have no idea what you're carrying. And it may have nothing to do with Washington. You may be empty. You may be bitter. You may feel like you've got famine. And this text says, dig a little deeper into your soul's purse, to the miracle that you were born at all, to the God-given power that has watched over you on a fantastic voyage from zygote to grown-up. I mean, what's this latest thing compared to that? Stand on that bedrock of your existence, which is God's gift of life. Refuse to panic or flee. Light the fire, light the spark to keep the fire going, and pass it on. All right? I'm trying to segue now. I'm thinking, well, how do I make that fit? Draw the circle wider. Right? But anyway, it'll work, all right?